several years ago when I first started working in New Testament studies, I did a webinar called 6 Bad Habits of New Testament Scholars and How to Avoid Them. This caused a bit of a stir because I was challenging fellow Christians as falling into these bad habits, and that was supposed to be bad. And it started the whole controversy about Lydia's bad tone and how dare she criticize fellow believers, etc. At the time that I did this, I remember my husband Tim said to me, "I hope you're going to hit the argument from silence," because he was emphasizing that's huge in New Testament studies. It's just a huge bad habit in New Testament studies. And I think I put it into the webinar. I certainly hope I did. But it took a while for it to come home to me just how right he was, just how much bad arguments from silence play a role in New Testament studies, including arguments that are accepted by Christian scholars, poor arguments that are accepted by Christian scholars. I did a video that you may have seen if you follow this YouTube channel called Arguments from Silence, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I should add a category, which I'm going to give an example of today, the silly. Okay, the good, the bad, and the silly. Because some arguments from silence are just so weird, so unexpected, so unpredictable, that they just kind of make you laugh. And you're left saying, why would anybody ever think that? So an example of a bad argument from silence that isn't quite so silly, like I'm about to illustrate today, would be Bart Ehrman's bad argument from silence, where he says, why don't the synoptics report that Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am? Surely he would do that. Now that's a bad argument from silence, and I'm not going to refute it again in this video, but it's at least a question that might occur to someone. Why don't they report it? But what I'm about to give you today is an utterly silly argument from silence, and it comes from Gary Burge, who's taught at various, evangelical schools and so forth. And it's in his list of what he calls, and other scholars call, aporias, or seams, in the Gospel of John. It's just in there in this list. And what I'm going to do to describe this to you is I'm going to read you a short passage from John 19. You've probably figured out by this time that I'm going through the list in order in the Gospel of John. So the last one was in the farewell discourse at John 16, and then today's is supposedly in John 19. So I'm going to read a passage from John and just pause then to think, is there some problem in this passage? Because there isn't. And it really takes a critical scholar to invent a problem that doesn't exist in this passage. So this is John 19, beginning at verse 4. They've just been the soldiers have just been abusing Jesus. He's been scourged. And then John 19:4, and Pilate came out again and said to them, Behold, I am bringing him out to you, that you may know that I find no guilt in him. Jesus therefore came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said to them, Behold the man. When therefore the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out, saying, Crucify, crucify. Pilate said to them, Take him yourself and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God. When Pilate therefore heard this statement, he was the more afraid. And he entered into the Praetorium again and said to Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. And then there's a little dialogue that goes on when Pilate presses him for an answer. So the last verse I read there was verse 9, and then in verse 13, Pilate brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat. Okay, so he's been in the back, as it were, talking with Jesus, and then he brings him out again. I hope you see that there's no problem in those verses. We can figure out what's happening quite easily just by reading them, normal reading comprehension. But this is what Burge says in his list, when this occurs in his list. In 19:5-9-13, Pilate leads Jesus out of the Praetorium twice in order to present him to the Jews as their king, without ever mentioning Jesus re-entering. In fact, when Pilate re-enters the Praetorium in 19:9, we are left wondering how he can speak with Jesus from verses 9 through 11, since Jesus was left in public view on the outside porch. So Burge literally says that in verse 9, Jesus was left in public view on the outside porch. Where is he getting that? Where is this coming from? On the contrary, when you read that Pilate is afraid because they said that he said he was the Son of God, he's a Roman, all right? And the Romans think, you shouldn't hurt a son of the gods. You can fall afoul, of the god if you hurt someone who's the son of the god. The Romans were kind of superstitious, so Pilate's afraid, and he goes into the Praetorium again, which is a little more private, not where the crowd can see, and he questions Jesus, where are you from? We just gather that Jesus was brought back either by the soldiers, that Pilate's gestures with his thumb, bring him back, or Pilate himself, but probably the soldiers who brought him out. Pilate's like, let's go back, and he goes back with Jesus. This is not a problem. And Burge actually attributes to the passage the meaning that Jesus was left in the outside porch merely because in verse 9, when it says Pilate entered the Praetorium again and said to Jesus, it doesn't say Pilate entered the Praetorium and Jesus entered the Praetorium. Pilate entered the Praetorium and he had Jesus brought back into the Praetorium. And, it doesn't spell that out. Burge then imposes upon the passage that there's a problem since Jesus was left in public view on the outside porch. This is bizarre. This is an argument from silence, the silly. Okay, the good, the bad, the ugly, the silly. Literally attributing to the gospel the meaning that Jesus was left outside because it doesn't spell it out, but Pilate had him brought back with Pilate because Pilate was planning to question him in the Praetorium. Where does this come from? How does this happen? How are scholars not called on this kind of thing and told, you can't do that? It doesn't say that. Why in the world would you think a thing like that? If you followed this page for a while, if you followed this YouTube channel or this podcast for a while, this example today may remind you of an example from the series on editorial fatigue and Mark Goodacre's treatment of editorial fatigue. And remember that there are evangelical scholars, supposedly conservative scholars, who buy and then sell to others Mark Goodacre's theory of editorial fatigue. And in one of the examples there, it's the story of the crippled man whose friends let him down through the ceiling, as told in Luke. And so Goodacre's theory is that Luke was editing this story, okay, as told in an earlier gospel, and that he created a problem by not explicitly saying that Jesus was in a house right in the very first verse of the story. So a couple of verses in, after it's talked about the crowds and the men could not bring their crippled friend through the crowd, Luke says that they went up onto the roof. And Goodacre says, very, very similar to what Burge says here, that they take their friend up onto the roof of a house which Jesus has not entered. So again, it's implying that there's a problem here, as if Luke had somehow said, oh no, Jesus was totally outside, he wasn't in a house, and then, oops, forgot that he was setting this outdoors, and then, 2 verses later, they took him up onto the roof. And it was just such a bumbler that he didn't realize that this created a clash with his intent to set the story outside. What? You just read it and you say, oh, okay, Jesus must have been in a house. That would make it all the more difficult to find your way through the crowd because there's less wiggle room. There are fewer routes to get to him. Basic reading comprehension allows us to just instantly infer that Jesus must have been in a building because it says very early in the story that they went up onto the roof. But no, Goodacre says that they're going up onto the roof of a house which Jesus has not entered. Similarly here, basic reading and hearing comprehension just leads us to say, okay, Jesus was brought back into the Praetorium as well. It doesn't have to actually say that in so many words. And then in verse 13, he has him brought back out. He sits down on the judgment seat when he's going to render his judgment. There is no problem here. And even more, now let's ask ourselves, if this is a theme, how does this indicate a complex composition process? Because remember, these themes are supposed to feed into this emphatic statement that Burge makes, that there's this cumulative case of a very complex composition process behind the Gospel of John and the involvement of at least one editor. Okay, what's supposed to have happened here? Are we supposed to believe that there was some tiny fragment that went up through, let's say, verse 8, and then a tiny fragment that went from verse 9 and following, and some later editor had these 2 fragments and spliced them together, and because the fragments didn't include an explicit statement that Jesus was taken back, the editor splicing forgot to add that in because that had somehow not been included because these were just fragmentary sources? Is that what we're supposed to think? Who knows? Burge doesn't say. And to make it even stranger, Burge supposedly defends an important role of John the Beloved Disciple in producing this book. So where would such fragments have come from? Would they just be little bits of things that the Beloved Disciple said, and this person wrote one of them down, this person wrote another of them down, and then they were incompetently edited together? Is that what we're supposed to think? Why even think that? Or are we supposed to think that it did contain a statement that Jesus was taken back, and then some incompetent editor just accidentally snipped it out, like it's like a word processing problem where you cut more than you intend to cut? Obviously, that's not a good theory. But Burge doesn't even bother to explain, because as I've mentioned before in this series, Burge just kind of throws everything in that aporia basket. Anything that he thinks is a little bit rocky, even things that, clearly indicate that this is the testimony of an eyewitness, unexplained allusions and so forth, or allusions to things that maybe he thinks some in his audience will know about, like the story of the woman who anointed Jesus' feet. But all that just gets thrown in this basket of what he later calls seismic seams, and it's a fractured gospel and all this kind of thing. So he doesn't feel he has to spell out the connecting points between this alleged problem, this problem which is actually entirely a critical creation, it's a non-existent problem, and the notion of a fractured compositional process. He doesn't bother. And scholars often don't demand that of one another. A scholar will just say something, and then the argument is supposed to be taken as read. And I would imagine that it happens pretty often that there are younger scholars or people new to the field that kind of think to themselves, how does that fit together? why are you saying that? And then, because they look around and nobody else is asking this question, they think to themselves, well, everybody else must know what the argument is. I must just be missing something. And they don't question because there's this enormous amount of peer pressure. It's a very common human sociological thing that happens. So I'm coming along and I'm saying, this is a really silly argument. Okay, we only have a couple more in this series, but I trust you'll keep coming back for the last couple of videos in this series on themes in the Gospel of John. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.